The morning sunlight filtered through the glass facade of Summit Crest Bank, casting soft, warm streaks onto the polished floors. Inside, the hum of muted conversations and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards filled the air, a symphony of routine in downtown Atlanta. Among the steady current of the day's activity stood Clara Evans, the newly appointed branch manager. Clara was a woman of ambition, though she carried it quietly. At 42, she was no stranger to hard work. Rising through the ranks of various local banks, she had fought for this position with everything she had. This job was her moment, a culmination of years spent proving herself. And though the weight of her own expectations pressed heavily on her shoulders, Clara told herself she was ready. Her team of tellers and advisors moved seamlessly through their tasks, their rhythm established long before her arrival. Clara felt the subtle distance that comes with being new. It wasn't unkind, just cautious, reserved. She understood that respect had to be earned, especially in a place like this. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she adjusted her blazer. Today will go smoothly, she thought, as if willing it into existence. Yet, as she moved across the lobby to observe the staff, her gaze lingered on the door. A nervous energy buzzed just beneath her composed exterior. In her mind, every client was a potential test, and she was determined not to fail. It was then that Elijah Brooks walked in. The door swung shut gently behind him, and his footsteps echoed faintly against the marble floor. He was a middle-aged man, unassuming, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans. He carried himself with the kind of ease that came from years of knowing exactly who he was. But Clara didn't notice that. Instead, she noticed the small fray at the cuff of his sleeve and the scuff marks on his shoes. He moved toward the counter, where one of the tellers greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. How can we help you today?" Elijah responded with a polite smile, his voice calm and measured. "I'd like to make a deposit." Clara, standing nearby, watched the interaction closely. There was nothing remarkable about the man at first glance, but something in her tightened a reflexive vigilance she didn't fully understand. She stepped forward before the teller could process his request. "I'll handle this one," Clara said, her tone professional but firm. Elijah nodded politely and handed over a piece of paper with his account details. Clara scanned it quickly before her brows furrowed, her eyes flicking to the screen on her computer. A moment of silence stretched thin between them. "Are you sure these details are correct?" she asked, lowering her voice. "Yes," Elijah replied without hesitation. His tone was calm, even patient, as if he had answered this question many times before. "And you'll need to prepare for the deposit. It's a transfer of $200 million. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Clara's hand froze above the keyboard, her mind racing. $200 million. The number felt almost absurd in its enormity. And Clara's instincts flared. Her pulse quickened, though her face remained impassive. "Sir," she said carefully, her voice hardening just slightly, "we don't tolerate scams here. If this is some sort of joke, I suggest you leave now." The man's expression didn't waver. He regarded her with quiet steadiness, his calm a stark contrast to the tension building in Clara's chest. "It's not a joke," he said simply. "Perhaps you'd like to see my business card." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She shook her head. "That won't be necessary. Scammers always carry fake cards. You can't fool me." Whispers began to ripple through the lobby. A few customers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued, but Clara barely noticed. She was too focused on the man before her, the confidence in his posture, the calm in his voice. It all felt wrong, out of place. In her mind, she saw the headlines she'd read so often: local banks scammed out of millions. And she told herself she was doing her job, protecting the bank, protecting herself. Elijah's calm never faltered. "You're making a mistake," he said softly, but Clara didn't hear him. Not really. Her assumptions were louder than his voice. From across the room, a tall figure entered the bank unnoticed by most. Marcus Harrington, the regional manager, observed the scene with sharp, discerning eyes. He stood there quietly for a moment, taking in every word, every gesture. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the air like the strike of a bell. "What's going on here?" Clara turned sharply, her face flushing. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her tone faltering slightly. "This man claims he has $200 million to deposit. I was just about to call security." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And why would you call security for that?" "Because he's obviously lying," Clara replied, her voice growing defensive. "Look at him." Marcus turned his gaze to Elijah, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Then he smiled a small, knowing smile. "Mr. Brooks," he said warmly, extending his hand. "It's been a while." The lobby fell silent. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her mind struggled to catch up with what she was hearing. You know him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I do," Marcus said, turning to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet Mr. Elijah Brooks, the owner of Brooks Enterprises and the largest investor in this bank." Clara felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Her assumptions, her confidence, everything unraveled in an instant. And though her face remained composed, the weight of her mistake settled heavily on her shoulders. The quiet hum of Summit Crest Bank continued, a steady rhythm of routine that comforted its patrons. Outside, the late morning sun shone brightly on the downtown streets, illuminating the neat rows of storefronts and the occasional passerby hurrying to their next destination. Inside, Clara Evans remained rooted behind the counter, her demeanor composed but her mind churning with the weight of her earlier decision. Across the room, Elijah Brooks sat patiently in a chair near the corner, his figure relaxed yet dignified. His quiet presence seemed almost out of place in the bustling bank. Not because of who he was but because of how easily he blended into the background. People walked past him without a second glance, their eyes sliding over the man in a well-worn shirt and simple jeans. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye. She was careful not to let her curiosity show, but it bubbled beneath her professional veneer. How could someone like him, dressed so plainly, speak with such confidence about millions of dollars? Her mind replayed the interaction in snippets, the calm way he'd handed over his account details, the unwavering assurance in his voice. It was unsettling. How much conviction he had. It was as if he belonged here, though everything about him seemed to suggest otherwise. The bank door swung open again, bringing with it a gust of warm air. Clara's gaze flicked toward the entrance, grateful for the distraction, but her attention quickly returned to Elijah. He sat there, waiting, without complaint or visible frustration. It was the kind of patience she wasn't used to seeing in customers, particularly those who claimed to be worth as much as he did. Her fingers tapped lightly against the counter. Clara had spent years building her career, climbing steadily from teller to manager. She prided herself on her ability to read people, to anticipate their needs before they voiced them. But today, her instincts felt unreliable, as though she'd stepped onto uncertain ground without realizing it. She glanced toward her colleagues, who were busy assisting other customers. None of them seemed to share her unease about Elijah. If anything, the tellers occasionally stole glances in his direction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Clara wasn't sure what to make of it. In the silence of her thoughts, she found herself wondering, could she have been wrong? The possibility lingered like an unwelcome guest. It wasn't the first time Clara had judged someone based on appearances, though she rarely acknowledged it to herself. It was a habit formed over years of caution, of trying to outthink potential risks before they materialized. But this time, the stakes felt higher, the consequences more immediate. Elijah shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture as he waited. The movement was subtle, unhurried, but it drew Clara's attention again. His calm demeanor, so steady and unshaken, grated against her sense of order. People who claimed outrageous things were supposed to be nervous, shifty, desperate, not calm, not composed, and certainly not polite. The moments stretched, each one pressing against Clara's resolve. She told herself that she was acting in the bank's best interest, that she was protecting its integrity. But beneath that rationale lay something more difficult to face, a quiet, unspoken bias that had slipped into her thoughts unnoticed. It wasn't a malicious prejudice, not in the overt sense, but rather a subtle assumption about who belonged and who didn't, about what wealth should look like, and who had the right to claim it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of measured footsteps approaching from behind. Marcus Harrington, the regional manager, entered the room with his usual quiet authority. He moved through the bank like a man who understood its every corner. His presence commanding but never imposing. Marcus didn't speak right away. Instead, he observed. His gaze swept across the lobby, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had seen far more than he ever let on. When his eyes landed on Elijah, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, subtle but unmistakable. Clara straightened instinctively as Marcus approached. He greeted her with a nod before turning his attention to Elijah. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and warm. Elijah stood, his posture respectful but unbowed. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," he replied with a small smile. Clara's stomach sank. The familiarity in their exchange was undeniable. She felt the blood drain from her face as the realization began to take shape. "You're Mr. Brooks," Marcus said, extending a hand. "It's a pleasure to see you again. I didn't know you'd be visiting this branch today." Elijah shook his hand firmly, his expression calm. "Just handling some business," he replied. "I didn't mean to cause a stir." Marcus's gaze shifted briefly to Clara, who stood frozen in place. His expression was unreadable, but there was a weight in his eyes that spoke volumes. Without addressing her directly, he turned back to Elijah and gestured toward his office. "Why don't we handle this in private?" Marcus suggested, his tone courteous. Elijah nodded, and together they walked toward the office, leaving Clara standing in stunned silence. Around her, the murmurs of the other customers swelled, a quiet wave of commentary that filled the room. Clara could feel their eyes on her, though none dared to speak directly to her. As the door to Marcus's office closed, the full weight of what had happened began to settle on Clara's shoulders. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that her judgment had been sound. But now, standing alone at the counter, she realized how fragile that certainty had been all along. Outside, the sunlight continued to stream through the glass, unchanged and indifferent, but for Clara, the day had shifted irrevocably, leaving her to reckon with a truth she could no longer ignore. Sometimes, the assumptions we hold are heavier than we realize. The door to Marcus Harrington's office clicked shut behind Elijah Brooks, muffling the sounds of the bustling bank. Clara Evans stood frozen near the counter, her thoughts scattered like papers caught in a sudden gust. The hum of activity around her seemed distant now, as if the world had taken a step back to leave her alone with her discomfort. She looked down at her hands, noticing the faint tremble in her fingers. It was a small, involuntary betrayal of the composure she had worked so hard to maintain. Clara had always prided herself on her ability to read people, to anticipate their intentions and needs before they voiced them. But this time, her instincts had failed her, or perhaps it was something more uncomfortable than instincts. Something she wasn't ready to name. The lobby was quieter now, though not silent. Customers exchanged hushed whispers, their voices carrying just enough for Clara to catch fragments of their conversations. "Did you see how calm he was? He didn't even argue." That manager, she jumped to conclusions. "Didn't she? It's always like this. People assume." Clara's chest tightened at the words, each one striking a chord she couldn't ignore. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had only been doing her job, protecting the bank from potential fraud. But the weight of their judgment and her own kept her silent. Behind the closed door of Marcus's office, Elijah sat comfortably in the chair opposite the desk. He wasn't surprised by what had happened. In truth, he'd experienced versions of it many times before. The skepticism, the sideways glances, the polite but firm rejections. It was a pattern he'd learned to navigate with patience. Still, there was a weariness to it, a quiet resignation that settled deep in his bones. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "I'm sorry about what happened out there, Elijah," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "You deserved better than that." Elijah offered a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not the first time," he said simply, "and I doubt it'll be the last." Marcus frowned, shaking his head. "It shouldn't have happened here, though. Not at Summit Crest. This bank wouldn't have survived the last recession without your investment. I don't think most people realize just how much we owe you." Elijah's smile softened, but his tone remained measured. I didn't invest in this bank for recognition, Marcus. I did it because I believed in what it stood for: a community-first approach. Treating people fairly, no matter their background. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. And yet, here we are. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window, his gaze distant. It's easy to put principles on paper, he said after a moment. Harder to live by them every day. People make mistakes. Sometimes it's ignorance, sometimes it's fear. Either way, it's not my job to hold grudges. In the lobby, Clara remained rooted to her spot. Her thoughts raced, replaying the interaction over and over again. She thought about the confidence in Elijah's voice, the quiet dignity in his manner. He hadn't raised his voice or demanded anything. He had simply stated his business and waited for her to see him for who he was. But she hadn't. Instead, she had seen only the surface, the worn edges of his shirt, the casual way he carried himself. And in those details, she had built a story about him that had nothing to do with the truth. The door to Marcus's office opened, and Elijah stepped out, his expression as calm as it had been when he arrived. Marcus followed, his jaw set, a hint of frustration lingering in his eyes. Marcus raised his voice slightly, addressing the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to formally introduce Mr. Elijah Brooks, he said, his tone steady but firm. He's the owner of Brooks Enterprises and the largest investor in Summit Crest Bank. Without his support, this branch and many others wouldn't be here today. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of surprise and unease. Clara felt her cheeks flush, the heat of embarrassment rising steadily. She tried to will herself to disappear into the polished floor, but there was no escape from the moment. Marcus turned to her, his expression neutral but his words sharp. Clara, he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to make her stand straighter. You've been here less than a month, and already I'm questioning your judgment. This is not how we treat our clients, especially not someone who has done so much for this institution. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. What could she say? That she didn't know? That Elijah hadn't looked the part? None of it would matter. The truth was simple and unyielding. She had failed. Marcus sighed, his disappointment evident. Mr. Brooks has shown us more grace than we deserve today. Let's not forget that. Elijah glanced at Clara briefly, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Marcus. I appreciate your words, Marcus, he said quietly, but let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. We all have our blind spots. Marcus nodded, though his jaw remained tight. Even so, we have a responsibility to be better. This kind of mistake can't happen again. Elijah gave a small nod of agreement but said nothing further. He glanced at Clara one last time before heading toward the exit, his stride unhurried, his composure intact. As the door swung shut behind him, the room seemed to exhale collectively. The customers resumed their conversations, though the energy in the bank felt different now, quieter, more reflective. Clara remained standing behind the counter, the weight of the moment settling heavily on her. She had made a mistake, one she couldn't take back. And though the day would go on, this was a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. The assumptions we carry are often invisible, even to ourselves, until they collide with the truth. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the streets of Atlanta softened under the golden light of late afternoon. Clara Evans sat on a worn bench in a small park not far from Summit Crest Bank, the distant hum of traffic blending with the occasional chirp of birds. In her lap, her hands rested motionless, the remnants of a day she wished she could rewrite clinging to her like shadows. It wasn't anger that filled her, it was something quieter, heavier. Regret had taken root, growing slowly in the hours since Elijah Brooks had walked out of the bank, leaving behind not anger or scorn, but a lesson Clara wasn't ready to face. She had replayed the day's events countless times, searching for the exact moment when she had faltered, when her instincts had been tainted by something deeper and more insidious. She had made assumptions about Elijah, about what someone wealthy should look like, how they should carry themselves. Those assumptions had guided her actions without her even realizing it. And yet, now that she reflected, it was clear as the sky above her she had let her bias, subtle and unexamined, shape her judgment. The park was nearly empty. save for a few others scattered across its paths and benches. Clara watched an elderly man shuffle by, leaning heavily on his cane, while a young woman in a nurse's uniform walked beside him, her hand hovering near his elbow in quiet support. The scene was simple, almost mundane, yet it struck Clara with unexpected force. It reminded her of what Elijah had said, how easy it was to put principles on paper but how hard it was to live by them. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the bench, letting the cool breeze brush against her face. Her mind wandered to her upbringing, to the lessons she had learned growing up in a modest suburban neighborhood. Her parents had taught her to value hard work, to judge people by their character, not their appearance. Yet somewhere along the way, life's complexities had muddied those ideals. She had absorbed unspoken rules, societal cues that whispered in the background of her thoughts. Wealth looks a certain way. Success carries itself with polish. People are what they present on the surface. And today, those whispers had guided her. She had looked at Elijah Brooks, a man who didn't fit the image she had unconsciously created, and dismissed him. She hadn't meant harm, but harm had been done nonetheless. That was the uncomfortable truth she couldn't escape. Blank. Blank. Across town, Elijah sat at the head of a long, polished conference table in the headquarters of Brooks Enterprises. The room was quiet now. The day's meetings concluded, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the framed photographs on the wall, snapshots of his journey from a young entrepreneur to the head of a company that had weathered decades of change. Today had been a reminder, not a revelation. He was used to being underestimated. It had followed him from the early days when he had struggled to secure funding for his first business, to boardrooms where his ideas were met with skepticism before they were proven right. He had learned to move past it, to focus on the work rather than the perceptions. But no matter how far he came, moments like the one at Summit Crest Bank lingered like echoes. They reminded him of how deeply ingrained those assumptions were, not just in individuals, but in the fabric of society itself. Elijah thought about Clara, about the way her confidence had faltered as the truth of his identity came to light. He didn't harbor anger toward her, there was no use in it. What lingered instead was a quiet frustration, not with Clara alone, but with the system that had shaped her instincts. The same system he had navigated all his life. Blank. Back in the park, Clara stood and began walking slowly along the winding path, her thoughts a steady companion. She knew she couldn't change what had happened, but she could change what came next. Perhaps that was the real test, not whether she could undo her mistake, but whether she could learn from it. Her feet carried her toward the street, where the city buzzed with its usual energy. Somewhere in the movement of people and cars, Clara found herself wondering about Elijah Brooks, not just as a wealthy man, but as a person. Who had he been before his success? What challenges had he faced that she couldn't begin to imagine? And what must it feel like to walk through life knowing that so many saw only a fraction of who he was? She paused at the edge of the sidewalk, watching as the city unfolded around her. The day had been humbling, and she wasn't sure where it would lead her next. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in hues of amber and shadow, Clara felt something shift. It wasn't absolution, not yet, but it was a start, a quiet acknowledgement of the work she needed to do. Not just to rebuild her career, but to understand herself more deeply. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The room was abuzz with quiet conversations, the kind that fill the air at charity events, where the hum of goodwill blends with the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter. Clara Evans stood near the back of the hall, her fingers loosely wrapped around a glass of sparkling water. She had debated attending tonight, unsure if she belonged among the crowd of philanthropists and business leaders who moved through the room with practiced ease. But something had urged her to come. Perhaps it was the hope for a sense of closure, or maybe redemption. It had been 6 months since she left Summit Crest Bank. 6 months of rethinking everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. In that time, Clara had taken steps to move forward. Though the journey had been anything but easy. She'd started volunteering at a local nonprofit, working with underprivileged youth. The work was challenging but grounding, forcing her to confront the biases she'd carried and the assumptions she'd made. Not just about others, but about herself. Still, moments like this standing in a crowd of strangers reminded her of the person she had been not long ago, confident, ambitious, eager to prove herself. And yet, that same confidence had blinded her. Tonight, she felt different, quieter, as if she were rediscovering herself piece by piece. Across the room, Elijah Brooks entered quietly, his presence commanding attention despite his unassuming demeanor. He wore a tailored suit, but it was his composure that set him apart, a calm, steady energy that drew people to him without effort. He greeted a few familiar faces, his polite nods and handshakes punctuated by genuine smiles. When his eyes fell on Clara, there was a brief moment of recognition, though his expression remained unreadable. Clara's heart quickened, but she stood her ground as he approached. She wasn't sure what she would say, or if he even wanted to speak with her, but she knew this moment mattered. "Elijah," she said, her voice steady but quiet as he reached her. "Clara," he replied, his tone measured. There was no malice in his voice, no trace of lingering anger, only the calm sincerity that seemed to define him. "It's been a while." "It has," she said, nodding. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." He tilted his head slightly. "This organization does good work. I like to support causes that align with my values." Clara hesitated, unsure of how to steer the conversation. Finally, she settled on the truth. "I owe you an apology," she said, the words coming slowly but firmly. "For what happened at the bank. For how I treated you. I've thought about it every day since." Elijah regarded her quietly for a moment, his gaze steady but not harsh. "And what have you learned?" he asked. Clara's brow furrowed as she considered the question. "That I was wrong," she said, "not just in what I assumed about you, but in how I let those assumptions guide my actions. I've spent the last few months trying to unlearn those habits. Trying to see people for who they are, not who I think they should be." Elijah nodded, his expression softening slightly. "That's a good start," he said. "The truth is, we all have blind spots. What matters is what we do once we recognize them." Clara felt a small sense of relief at his words, though she knew they weren't an absolution. She didn't expect one. "I don't know if I'll ever get it completely right," she admitted, "but I'm trying. That's all anyone can do," Elijah said. He paused, glancing around the room before turning back to her. "I hear you've been volunteering at New Horizons." Clara blinked in surprise. "How did you?" "I stay connected with the community," he said with a faint smile. "It's good work you're doing there. Meaningful. It's been eye-opening," Clara said. "Humbling, too." Elijah studied her for a moment, as if weighing something. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple business card. Extending it to her, Clara hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against the smooth cardstock. "We're looking for someone to lead a new initiative at Brooks Enterprises," he said. "It's a role that requires someone willing to listen, to learn, and to build relationships across different communities. If you're interested, give me a call." Clara stared at the card, her heart pounding. "Why me?" she asked, looking up at him. "Because I believe in second chances," Elijah said simply. "And because I think you have the potential to do good work if you're willing to put in the effort." For a moment, Clara couldn't speak. The weight of his offer settled over her. Not as a burden but as an opportunity, a chance to prove to herself and to others that she could be better. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. Elijah nodded. "That's all I ask." As he moved on to greet other attendees, Clara stood alone for a moment, the business card still in her hand. She felt the quiet buzz of the room around her, the mingling of voices and laughter. But for the first time in months, she felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about making amends, it was about moving forward with purpose. About becoming the person she wanted to be. And in that quiet moment, Clara realized something important. Second chances weren't just about redemption. They were about growth. About seeing the world and herself with clearer eyes. She slipped the card into her pocket and stepped into the crowd, ready to take the next step.